So when it comes to ancient metrology, it is a really interesting ancient science, and it really does give us a clue as to what the ancients were up to. Obviously, John Neal and John Michel were the pioneers of this kind of bringing this science back into the public domain. It was almost like a lost science, and it was overlooked by academia because it was so confusing. There were so many different numbers and different measurements and different cultures using all these sort of different, sizes. And so, it took John Michel in his book Ancient Metrology from 1982 to start putting that back together. And he kind of he was involved with John Neal even back then. He was good friends with him. And John Neal then kind of took it on board and expanded it. He kind of got deep into it and really started kind of bringing out the magic within it. Finding between him, both the Johns, they found these modules of different measurements, all based around the English foot, which is a really important understanding because once you have that, then you can see these ratios occurring, these measurements with these ratios occurring at many different sites. And they found that, so one site like Stonehenge, for instance, can have, more than one of these measurements. And it would confuse people because it doesn't make sense. Surely there's one standard unit of measure. Well, actually, no, there's multiple different measurements and they're all related to each other, almost like in a musical scale. And they function perfectly together. And so different designers and for different reasons and different qualities, you bring in these slightly different measurements into these sites. It was really John Neal, who was absolute legend in many different ways, not just in ancient metrology, who kind of really brought this to the world. And he published All Done with Mirrors, which is his kind of classic tome. Extremely hard work for those that just are new to the subject, because it's like learning a whole new language, the language of number, number and harmony and other such things. And so, yeah, I've got to give him full credit. I'm really sad that he passed away recently in August. I became, quite friendly with him over the years. We had good times together, and obviously he was a big part of the Megalithomania conference and everything we did for many, many years. So when it comes to John Neal's contribution to ancient metrology, he is the master. He's the man. There's no one else on the planet who took it as far as he did. So he really is the number one ancient metrologist on the planet, or he was. And I think it's going to be hard for anyone to top that because he took it to such a deep level. And his legacy stands. And I think this is what's important. He got the books out, and I think the having it in book form is the key. He's got it in book form. He's got 2 or 3 volumes. He's got like the Measuring the Megaliths book he wrote many years ago, like 2006, I think, plus All Done with Mirror. So between them, you've got his entire life's work. And so you can base everything upon that. So I think his legacy is intact. And we have, like myself, we have people like Adam Tetlow, we have different people who are taking and utilizing the system that they brought to light into their work, into my work as well. And it all starts to make sense because before this, before the 2 Johns did their work on metrology, we had the megalithic yard that was discovered by Alexander Thom, the Scottish engineer who studied and measured all the stone circles. But there was something not quite, it didn't kind of fill in all the gaps. And this is where the 2 Johns came in, and John Neal took it to the whole other level. And so, although the megalithic yard still functions, the discovery of Alexander Thom, that is, the variations on the foot are really where it's at. And I think that is where we need to take, when we go into sites where new research is done, that module, that system has to be implemented. I think that's the way forward in this subject. So there are people working on metrology since the last few years, since the passing of John Neal. We have Adam Tetlow, who's kind of pretty much a master geometer, and he fully understands the whole system, the whole modules, everything that John Michel and John Neal put together. He runs a metrology course which can be joined. You can contact Adam Tetlow, and he can actually join this course. It started recently, and I'm part of it. I've joined it. I've been going to the classes, and you can catch up on the classes as well. But Adam's really taken it, and he's really maintaining it. He's teaching it in classes. He's not just he's written a book about it that's hopefully going to be published soon. Also, John Martineau. He was a good friend with John, or both the Johns, who founded Megalithomania with me and Gareth Mills back in 2006. He, as well, has a very high understanding of John Neal's work and implements that into his research, and he has that included in his series of wooden books. I've been looking at it as well. You know, I'm not at the level of John or Adam, but I have been implementing the system into earlier sites that John Neal didn't have a chance to look at, like Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe in southeast Turkey, which go back to nearly 12,000 years. And so I think, and I'm going to make a big deal of that. I mean, I included that in my wooden book, but I'm also going to be including that in my next book I'm doing with JJ Ainsworth, where we're going to be very much focused on the system that John Neal kind of championed and created, and apply that. And we've already done it. We've already applied it to Göbekli Tepe and Kara, and we're finding all sorts of measurements that they were using even that far back. And so this system may have been around for a lot longer than people realize. But I think it's in good hands. But I think it needs to be addressed by academia. I think they need to kind of take on the challenge of ancient metrology and actually apply that to measurements, because nowadays, you know, this is partly based on what Alexander Thom did. Everyone's looking for one standard unit of measure in every ancient site. We have Mike Parker Pearson. He found what's called the Longfoot, which is 1.05 feet at Stonehenge, and he forced into it. Tried to find that the whole site was based upon this measurement, but it's not. It's based on multiple different measurements, including that one, which is in fact the Persian foot, which is also found in Göbekli Tepe thousands of years earlier. And so, you know, so archaeologists need to kind of get their head around John's work. I think that's the key, because we have myself, we have alternative researchers, we have Adam, who's a teacher, doing it, but it needs to be taken a bit further. But it's in good hands. It's going to be certainly expanded upon by various people, but I think it needs to be taken a step further. So I spent quite a bit of time with John Neal over the years, and it's always been very, very amusing. He doesn't take fools gladly. He swears whenever he wants, even on stage at Megalithomania, and he kind of attacks people if they're not quite doing the metrology correctly, publicly, in front of people, on stage sometimes. So that's been quite interesting to kind of observe that and try and monitor that, and you know, cut out the swear words in the edits occasionally. But, you know, there's one time me and him were at a late friend John Agnew's conference called the Stars and Stones Forum in Suffolk, also organised by Edmund Marriage, who passed away. And we were there, and I was actually there with my mum. She came along because it was in the east side of the country. She lives in Cambridge, so we came along, and John Neal was like this legend. So I thought, I better introduce John Neal to my mum. You know, just a polite thing to do. And I said, "Oh, hey mum, this is John Neal," and so on and so forth. And he looked at me surprised, looked at her, and he said, "Hugh, I thought you were hatched from an egg." And my mum burst out laughing, and so that was one of the funny moments. There's been a few other moments as well, usually based upon John swearing and drinking, and other such things, which I can't really get into on here. But let's just say he was a bit of a bad boy, and he, you know, if you get to know the people closer to him, you're going to hear some outrageous stories. But he was a real legend. I mean, I really looked up to him. He kind of, you know, kind of took me under his wing a little bit in sometimes, and he sort of pushed me to kind of look at his work, and he would explain it to me in a bit more detail. He was always there with a calculator. This is one thing that him and John Michel always had in their top pocket, always on their calculator, trying to just work out little ancient measurements wherever they went. And I found that really cool. You know, I started doing that for a while, and now you got phones, you can do it on it and everything else. But they would literally, like, you know, they were on their little devices 20, 30 years ago or more, working stuff out like you do on a kind of smartphone nowadays. So they kind of, you know, inspired me to constantly check measurements, constantly like work things out. And you can quite easily do it based upon the module that they came up with. You know, it's not difficult to do. If you just know the numbers, you know the measurements, you know the ratios, you can just, you know, you can quickly get a measurement of a site, and you can work out what whole number measurement they were using. And I think that's the key. So I just have these memories of John, you know, sitting there with his calculator, often in the most inappropriate times, working things out, and often swearing quite a lot as well.
John Neal was a great researcher in historical metrology, really unique, and he did so much research. And even up until just a few months ago, he was still putting articles out on academia. I really admired his work, and he really put in so much detail. He was absolutely convinced that the ancient system was methodical and systematic and based on precise measurements of the earth, and as many people who are independent researchers in metrology can see, but he was really brilliant on accuracy and precision and telling the story. This book in particular is my favorite, the one where he talks about the Arabian, Egyptian, and Chinese metrology, and you can see all the connections. It's a worldwide system, and it's all about geometry as well. It's so precise in terms of the numbers of units, the way that they relate to each other, and you can see that long ago, you can't really question the fact that long ago there was a really highly scientific and precise culture that produced these units of measure. And John managed to really over and over again show that in his books, and this is going all around the world. So as I say, this is China and obviously Egypt and the Middle East, but well beyond that. And he was so charismatic. Like, he really had lots of personality. He was funny, quite acerbic, and he was always joining in recent years on the debates and discussions on the academia website. And he could be very cutting. And he was very honest about his views, and he believed he was right, as we all do. But it was always just such a pleasure to see his comments and to see him, if it was something that was a bit cutting for somebody else. And we had a bit of an exchange of messages on academia over the last few years, which was really nice for me. I was able to ask him, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? I have this unit, but I'm not sure. No. And he would definitely disagree with me. In particular, he disagreed with measuring, well, considering units in inches. For him, it was all about the foot, which is not that different, but you have to see the foot. The foot is the main module, the English foot, and from there, everything else follows. And that's fair enough. His system was based on that view. And it was so nice to have all these exchanges. Like, sometimes he was really, really encouraging. He would say things like, there are so many parallels to our respective studies, and I was pleased to see you have the same misgivings on the identification of the French Pied de Roi that have puzzled me over the years. But then, this is very John Neal, I think, he added on this particular occasion, I'm unable to tackle it at present because yesterday's mushrooms are in conflict with today's gin. But I am quite sure I may assist you towards an understanding. Sincerely, John Neal. And that was one particular message that made me smile. And another one beginning with, Christ Almighty, Miss Campbell, where to start? At least your inquiries are well formulated. So, and even his papers would begin with this kind of tone, like one of the recent ones he put out on academia, all done with mirrors, a kind of apology. And that's just a really fantastic paper, just a short paper, a summary of some of his views. And starting with, oh, buggery, I thought I'd get away with it. Posting up ADWM without explanation, that is. Now I have to explain. 24 years ago, Jesus H. Christ, exclamation mark. All done with mirrors was published, part of my researches into the subject. So he goes on and on. And actually behind all this is very precise work. He was obviously a colleague of John Michel's and a friend of his, and that was a very important part of his life. And he mentioned him a lot in his work and in his comments and his messages. And I really, really value all his research, all the books that he read, the many, many books that he read to come up with all these values. And I would always consult his books if I'm writing something about a particular unit or a particular system or something. And I have to say, it's absolutely fun. There's nothing else like it. I don't know of any other book that's actually published. I mean, there are lots of really good metrology researchers out there, but a published book that's got so much. Let's say this is my favorite. So I'm really, really indebted to John Neal. I think his work is absolutely fantastic. And I miss him, even though I never met him. And I really enjoyed exchanges our written exchanges, our correspondence, you could say. He was a great man.
So what can we say about John Neal and the legacy that he's left behind for anybody interested in the fields of metrology and geodesy? Well, firstly, metrology is the science of measurement, and geodesy is specifically the science of measuring the size and shape of planet Earth. For more than 2,000 years, various researchers, polymaths, geodeters, and philosophers have been trying to make sense of the various monuments built throughout the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. It's abundantly clear that the people that built these monuments had a very sophisticated knowledge of geodesy and metrology, but it's been very difficult to link these things together. Various researchers have come to their own conclusions and contributed a great deal to this, but what John Neal has done is he's really unified these ideas, and he's looked into the research of others, starting back in antiquity with the likes of Eratosthenes and Vitruvius. John Neal then takes us through the Islamic Renaissance and looks at the research being done then, and then he looks into the work of his contemporaries. So he talks about the work of John Michel, Livius Tacchini, and others around that period of time. And what John Neal has really done is he's shown us that all of these systems of measurement are actually intrinsically linked, which tells us that there was probably a single group of people that were using a common system at some point deep in the ancient past. And what's really interesting is that from John Neal's measurements and comparisons, is that we can actually start to see that these units are all actually derived from Earth measures. So what we can see is that geodesy and metrology were intrinsically linked in the ancient past. As far as my own research is concerned, I'm still really quite new to the work of John Neal. I've really been trying to avoid the work of others until I reached my own conclusions. So more recently, I've been looking into the work of people like Tacchini, John Michel, and of course, John Neal. John Neal's assessment of the Ring of Brodgar has forced me to reassess my own ideas. He expands upon the work of Alexander Thom, where you can see not only the megalithic yard at Brodgar, but you can also see the Royal Egyptian cubit. This forces us to ask some deep questions, and it also allows us to start analysing other sites in Britain using the same measurement systems. John Neal also has this concept of canonical numbers, which is a group of common numbers that keep turning up from sites all over the world. Some of these canonical numbers are starting to turn up in my own research, so John Neal's work is starting to tie in with mine, and I believe it's going to lead me to some very interesting conclusions in the very near future. Over the years, John Neal has released various books and other publications which serve as the perfect reference for anybody who wants to get into the fields of ancient geodesy and metrology. I think really he's formed part of a larger legacy with some of his other contemporaries. I think the research that has come out of his generation in particular is going to one day force people in the future in the fields of archaeology and history to reassess their ideas about the ancient past. At the very minimum, it raises questions as to why are people in different parts of the world seemingly using a common system, and how did they get this knowledge from one place to another?
Hello, my name is Hugh Evans. I'm author of the Origin series, which is the origin of the zodiac, the origin of time, and the origin of numbers. And I had the pleasure of meeting John Neal in May this year with Paul Smith, and we interviewed John near his home in North London. John's work only became apparent to me after I'd started my writing, but it soon became very important to include his concepts and a summary of his work. John spent his whole life trying to understand the origin of the measurement systems that he initially became aware of as he grew up in the countryside of England. And in my belief, he has researched the origins of the foot-based measurement system right back to great antiquity and its true origin. And this is an incredibly important achievement. And John Neal deserves far more recognition for his achievement. It is equivalent of several doctorates. You can see his work on academia.org or whatever that website is. So he has released a lot of his work there for free viewing. He's written 3 books with one still to be published. His first book was called Opus 2, all done with mirrors, because Opus 1 was actually his papers that he had released on academia.org. And he reorganized his work into 3 volumes following Opus 2, and they are Ancient Metrology, Volume 1, Volume 2, and the soon to be published, I hope, Volume 3. All of his work is essential reading for anybody who wishes to understand metrology back to its origin. So John's legacy should be great, and he should be recognized as one of the great thinkers of our time. He deferred quite often to John Michell. John Michell was also a great thinker and was involved in many areas of bringing ancient thought into the modern mind. John Neal focused mainly on metrology. Together they have created a vast amount of work which is part of British history and should be understood in that context. I can only really say that John Neal's work was very important to mine. I refer to him many times in my book, The Origin of Numbers. I believe that the foot-based measurement system is evident on all continents of the earth, going back to extremely great antiquity, including the Great Pyramids of Giza, which may be up to 10,000 years old. It is inherently connected to the Royal Egyptian cubic and other measurement systems like that, as well as the meter and the megalithic yard. So thank you, John Neal. You deserve to be never forgotten, and I will be championing your work for as long as I can. Thank you very much.
I knew John Neal through his works, of course, but also through an email correspondence. I became extremely vexed with Britain's history and heritage organisations because of their desire to metricate British history and heritage. So I had to go at them. I had to go at one small one, and I had great success in putting them back into the imperial system, which John Neal exhibited to us as a universal measurement system, as an echo of a universal measurement system from the ancient world. And I produced this piece, which has subsequently been published. And he came up with the wonderful thing. He said he didn't take hostages. And he said, quite a competent little article. That was a howitzer shell dodged. Thank you, John Neal. Very, very decently peer-reviewed my article. Thank you very much indeed. A very sad loss. His book, Opus 2, in my view, is a masterpiece of metrology. And his basic message was that there was the universality of ancient measuring systems. And he advocated prehistoric science. He had this, I just looked at Opus 2 this morning. It's absolutely wonderful. A rich source of information on history as well as the metrology. And he says, of the lifestyle of the megalithic age, the picture the scholars paint is of blighted, superstitious savages clinging to a precarious existence in a hostile world for the short and brutal span of his often diseased and afflicted time upon earth. This is so opposed to what certain of the evidence suggests that it may well be viewed as the polar opposite of the probable reality. And his book, the Opus 2, the subtitle is all done with mirrors, and he made the claim that anthropologists were talking twaddle. He said he cited the fictitious absurdities that comprise the framework of modern anthropology. And he further went on about the countless nations. All may as well have poured upwards from a hole in the earth for all that is truly known of their origins. And he said, yet virtually nothing is done about concrete metrological evidence, weights and measures, while myriad scholars interminably discuss abstracts such as these hypotheses of the origins of words and the migratory nations. And he was completely on the ball, in my view. He was totally, and he just cracked it, but not totally. And this is interesting. He said the two primary keys to the solution of this ancient metrological system are that all the separate feet relate to another by a single fraction, and each of these separate feet have multiple values that differ from each other, also by single but lesser fractions. That's about it, really, is what he wrote. Now, he determined that right at the heart of ancient metrology was the English foot. And this is a fantastic echo from the ancient world. He said, I mean, if you look at the picture on the front here, you've got an obviously very civilized fellow, and he's got a mask of a barbarian, a lesser kind of person. But he said he got it all down to the English foot. And I had this narc with these history and heritage organizations, some of whom won't even engage with you incidentally because they're so full of wokery, anything negative, and they just won't engage with you. But I did have this great success. And what he said was this. He said the knowledge of the ancient world goes beyond metrology into the number system which governs nature or physics. It was not devised. Too many points of correspondence indicate the fact that the system was a discovery. It is no more an invention than Newton invented gravity or Einstein invented relativity, but was understood in the ancient world with as great a clarity as these subjects are understood in the modern. But he said that we haven't quite cracked it. The clear definition of just how length, proportion, and ratios combine remains just out of reach, but it will be found, and it will be simple. That time and distance have a more intricate relationship related to the laws of physics is undoubted. The linkage awaits discovery. What John Neal's achievement, he's very graciously acknowledged John Michel as the pioneer in this area of describing him as having a bullseye and getting those fractions of English feet, of all the different feet in the world. And he actually took the discipline on in a historic and, in my view, legendary way. He was a fantastic bloke and a fantastic scholar, and he is a great loss. And I salute his contribution, which was absolutely magnificent. So thank you, John Neal. And your loss is very keenly felt here by John Hart, the creator of the National CV of Britain. Godspeed.
Well, it's something that John Michel realized, that if we could understand the numbers in the dimensions of ancient temples, stone circles, pyramids, then we could understand what the architects and builders and surveyors that laid out these buildings were thinking. And John Michel's book, Ancient Metrology, and John Neal's work is, his studies of ancient metrology after John Michel conclusively sort of proved that they were using specific numbers that fitted with the dimensions of the Earth and the dimensions of the Moon. And it's, this is such an important discovery, really. And it's something that the classical writers, Newton, John Dee, Roger Bacon, plenty of Arab and Chinese scholars were all, they all knew this system was there. And no one was able to fully conclusively prove it until John Michell and John Neal came along. So, it's a way to see into the minds of ancient people and to understand why they built what they built, where they built it, why it was the size, why things like, say, Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat's got 2 rows of statues pulling on a big rope. It's supposed to be, this sort of opposing forces churning the sort of cosmic, what do you call them, pestle and mortar that grinds the whole universe into existence. Now there's 54 of them on each side. 54 and 54 is 108. There's 1080 miles in the diameter of the moon. Just simple stuff like that. So that, it's very interesting because it's a layered system. So the more imagine a fairy tale. As a child, you learn a fairy tale in a very simple way. It appeals to your imagination in a very simple way. But as you grow older, that fairy tale, you might realize, has a moral lesson. As you grow even older, you might realize there are other lessons in there, perhaps about marriage or facing death or even craftsmanship or agriculture. And so ancient knowledge tends to have these layers as part of their understanding. And those layers are usually held in mythology and in number. And, we can do a lot to understand mythology. And, there's great traditions of interpretation of mythic symbols and, whether that's Jung and Hillman and that thread, or someone like Schwaller de Lubic's and René Guénon and that thread. But it still remains in the area of interpretation. Whereas once you're dealing with numbers that are non-controversial lengths measured by professional surveyors, professional archaeologists, noted in their research, once you use those non-controversial numbers, you can actually prove the existence of a global dissemination of this entire system before the time of the earliest stone circles, say those built in Brittany at Karnak. All of these measures are there. John's legacy, we don't necessarily know how wide it's going to spread, but once people start to cotton on to what he's actually achieved, his legacy is that he's proved that there was a global culture in deep antiquity before the time of historical records, because he's proved that you've got all these measures that he identified and found from archaeological studies, and it turns out that these measures are found all over the world. So we've got something that, say, Herodotus or Pliny would refer to as a Greek or a Roman foot, but we're finding those feet have been found in China, in Peru. They've been found in stone circles long before the Romans even existed, or built those stone circles built long before Romans even existed. So that he's essentially given us a mathematical proof for the existence of a high culture before the time of the stone circles being built. And to do that, he's fixed all of these errors in reasoning or errors in measurement that have come from other people trying to solve the same problem. So we've got Newton or John Dee, or in the modern world someone like Berryman or Livio Stachini, and they all sort of navigated around this same area that John eventually solved, but because of lack of data or lack of measurements, or just not being able to solve that final puzzle, there's lots of sort of errors in the history of metrology. And so what John did was solve and correct those errors. So his legacy is, if you want to study ancient metrology, that's where to start. You know, forget the earlier metrologists. Yes, read them once you've understood John Neal, but as a historical note to his final solution of the problem. I wish I knew. You know, as far as I know, there's me. I've worked with Nosh for 10, 15 years, and I have made my own discoveries, which are, you know, more like icing on John's great cake. You know, I tend to think that John Michel discovered the recipe. John Neal actually found the ingredients and put the whole thing together and baked the cake, and I've come along and put a tiny bit of icing on top. And so as far as I know, there's only me. I'd be happy to meet anyone else that is interested, because it's quite a lonely world. You know, there are contemporaries of mine that understand it, but don't necessarily study it in detail. There are contemporaries of John who also understand it, but you know, again, they're working on their own areas, so that, you know, they're not necessarily doing new research in that area.
Perhaps I should point out that Adam is currently running a course on ancient metrology. That's right, isn't it, Adam?
Yeah, that's right. It's called The Ancient Number Science. You can find it through my Instagram at Adam Tetlow Teaching.
Lovely stuff.
So what was it like learning under Nosh? Well, the first, we had a friend in common, John Martineau, dear friend. He publishes my books and also publishes John's books. And because we had this close friend in common, we immediately were on a level. But whenever I talked to him about metrology, I'd get about 5 minutes into this conversation, my eyes would just glaze over, and he'd be reeling off all these numbers, and I couldn't even keep up with him. And of course he realized that. And so there was only so far we could go. And, you know, what he said to me is basically I had to go away, study his work so I could ask the proper questions. And then once that happened, things were very different. And, you know, he was open to questions to the most minute detail. But the way that usually worked is we'd meet in the pub, and, you know, he had 3 or 4 favorite pubs in West London that, you know, where he lived. And so we'd go to one pub, and, you know, Nosh's drink at lunchtime was always half a beer and a whiskey or a Jameson. And so we'd go to one pub, we'd have a half and a Jameson each, and we'd chat and ask questions. Then we'd go to the next pub, repeat again, and the next pub. And by the time we got to the third pub, my questions and his answers seemed to remain good, actually, whatever state he was in. But my questions and ability to understand his answers was certainly diminished. And so that was that, you know, so I learned very quickly to get all my difficult questions in the first hour of us together, because, you know, by the time things had moved on, neither of us were really quite in that state. And, you know, he always had a massive sense of humor, John. And, you know, he had all sorts of anecdotes of him and John Michel arguing, and, you know, especially over the discovery of metrology, good-natured arguing amongst best mates. So yeah, so we you know, we've mainly learnt in the pub. It's a nice place to sit. You know, we got our calculators out, we sat there, we'd discuss things. I'd come to him with questions or possibly things that I'd noticed. And, you know, he was very pleased as I progressed in my understanding that I'd actually noticed a few things that had gone by him, surprisingly, because, you know, his exhaustive and comprehensive study of all of the material left very little left to answer. But I, you know, being a geometer, I noticed that there's particular geometric ways to find those measures, and there's particular relations with the Fibonacci sequence, the golden section. And so I was able to answer just a few minor things. But he had a sense of humor. You know, once at Christmas, he went down to the newsagent, and there are these cheeky teenagers outside, and, you know, he's there with his grey hair and his moustache, and they said to him, "Are you Santa?" And he turned around to him quick as a flash, and he said, "No, I'm Satan, you dyslexic cunt." So, you know, he was always ready with a quick one-liner, you know, despite being, you know, nearly 90 when he died, he was always sharp as a tack. And yeah, you didn't want to get him enraged.
No, he certainly was. What a character and what an absolute genius. Thank